the new God of omnipresence, the new gods of omnipresence, the new God of omnipresence, the new goddess of omnipresence, the new goddesses of omnipresence, the new goddess of omnipresence, the old God of omnipresence, the old gods of omnipresence, the old God of omnipresence, the old goddess of omnipresence, the old goddesses of omnipresence, the old goddess of omnipresence, the greater God of omnipresence, the greater gods of omnipresence, the greater God of omnipresence, the greater goddess of omnipresence, the greater goddesses of omnipresence, the greater goddess of omnipresence, the lesser God of omnipresence, the lesser gods of omnipresence, the lesser God of omnipresence, the lesser goddess of omnipresence, the lesser goddesses of omnipresence, the lesser goddess of omnipresence, the higher God of omnipresence, the higher gods of omnipresence, the higher God of omnipresence, the higher goddess of omnipresence, the higher goddesses of omnipresence, the higher goddess of omnipresence, the lower God of omnipresence, the lower gods of omnipresence, the lower God of omnipresence, the lower goddess of omnipresence, the lower goddesses of omnipresence, the lower goddess of omnipresence, the greater spirit of omnipresence, the greater spirits of omnipresence, the greater spirit of omnipresence, the lesser spirit of omnipresence, the lesser spirits of omnipresence, the lesser spirit of omnipresence, the higher spirit of omnipresence, the higher spirits of omnipresence, the higher spirit of omnipresence, the lower spirit of omnipresence, the lower spirits of omnipresence, the lower spirit of omnipresence, the major God of omnipresence, the major gods of omnipresence, the major God of omnipresence, the major goddess of omnipresence, the major goddesses of omnipresence, the major goddess of omnipresence, the minor God of omnipresence, the minor gods of omnipresence, the minor God of omnipresence, the minor goddess of omnipresence, the minor goddesses of omnipresence, the minor goddess of omnipresence, the superior God of omnipresence, the superior gods of omnipresence, the superior God of omnipresence, the superior goddess of omnipresence, the superior goddesses of omnipresence, the superior goddess of omnipresence, the inferior God of omnipresence, the inferior gods of omnipresence, the inferior God of omnipresence, the inferior goddess of omnipresence, the inferior goddesses of omnipresence, the inferior goddess of omnipresence, the ancestor God of omnipresence, the ancestor gods of omnipresence, the ancestor God of omnipresence, the ancestor goddess of omnipresence, the ancestor goddesses of omnipresence, the ancestor goddess of omnipresence, the ascendant God of omnipresence, the ascendant gods of omnipresence, the ascendant God of omnipresence, the ascendant goddess of omnipresence, the ascendant goddesses of omnipresence, the ascendant goddess of omnipresence, the descendant God of omnipresence, the descendant gods of omnipresence, the descendant God of omnipresence, the descendant goddess of omnipresence, the descendant goddesses of omnipresence, the descendant goddess of omnipresence, the transcendent God of omnipresence, the transcendent gods of omnipresence, the transcendent God of omnipresence, the transcendent goddess of omnipresence, the transcendent goddesses of omnipresence, the transcendent goddess of omnipresence, the past God of omnipresence, the past gods of omnipresence, the past God of omnipresence, the past goddess of omnipresence, the past goddesses of omnipresence, the past goddess of omnipresence, the present God of omnipresence, the present gods of omnipresence, the present God of omnipresence, the present goddess of omnipresence, the present goddesses of omnipresence, the present goddess of omnipresence, the future God of omnipresence, the future gods of omnipresence, the future God of omnipresence, the future goddess of omnipresence, the future goddesses of omnipresence, the future goddess of omnipresence, the authentic God of omnipresence, the authentic gods of omnipresence, the authentic God of omnipresence, the authentic goddess of omnipresence, the authentic goddesses of omnipresence, the authentic goddess of omnipresence, the synthetic God of omnipresence, the synthetic gods of omnipresence, the synthetic God of omnipresence, the synthetic goddess of omnipresence, the synthetic goddesses of omnipresence, the synthetic goddess of omnipresence, the progressive god of omnipresence, the progressive gods of omnipresence, the progressive god of omnipresence, the progressive goddess of omnipresence, the progressive goddesses of omnipresence, the progressive goddess of omnipresence, the regressive god of omnipresence, the regressive gods of omnipresence, the regressive god of omnipresence, the regressive goddess of omnipresence, the regressive goddesses of omnipresence, the regressive goddess of omnipresence, the ordinary god of omnipresence, the ordinary gods of omnipresence, the ordinary god of omnipresence, the ordinary goddess of omnipresence, the ordinary goddesses of omnipresence, the ordinary goddess of omnipresence, the extraordinary god of omnipresence, the extraordinary gods of omnipresence, the extraordinary god of omnipresence, the extraordinary goddess of omnipresence, the extraordinary goddesses of omnipresence, the extraordinary goddess of omnipresence, the static god of omnipresence, the static gods of omnipresence, the static god of omnipresence, the static goddess of omnipresence, the static goddesses of omnipresence, the static goddess of omnipresence, the dynamic god of omnipresence, the dynamic gods of omnipresence, the dynamic god of omnipresence, the dynamic goddess of omnipresence, the dynamic goddesses of omnipresence, the dynamic goddess of omnipresence, the land god of omnipresence, the land gods of omnipresence, the land god of omnipresence, the land goddess of omnipresence, the land goddesses of omnipresence, the land goddess of omnipresence, the sea god of omnipresence, the sea gods of omnipresence, the sea god of omnipresence, the sea goddess of omnipresence, the sea goddesses of omnipresence, the sea goddess of omnipresence, the sky god of omnipresence, the sky gods of omnipresence, the sky god of omnipresence, the sky goddess of omnipresence, the sky goddesses of omnipresence, the sky goddess of omnipresence, the god of omnipresence, the gods of omnipresence, the god of omnipresence, the goddess of omnipresence, the goddesses of omnipresence, the goddess of omnipresence, the half-god of omnipresence, the half-gods of omnipresence, the half-god of omnipresence, the half-goddess of omnipresence, the half-goddesses of omnipresence, the half-goddess of omnipresence, the vessel of omnipresence, the vessels of omnipresence, the vessel of omnipresence, the name of omnipresence, the names of omnipresence, the name of omnipresence, the person of omnipresence, the persons of omnipresence, the person of omnipresence, the persona of omnipresence, the personas of omnipresence, the persona of omnipresence, the personage of omnipresence, the personages of omnipresence, the personage of omnipresence, the personality of omnipresence, the personalities of omnipresence, the personality of omnipresence, the personification of omnipresence, the personifications of omnipresence, the personification of omnipresence, the image of omnipresence, the images of omnipresence, the image of omnipresence, the imagination of omnipresence, the imaginations of omnipresence, the imagination of omnipresence, the belief of omnipresence, the beliefs of omnipresence, the belief of omnipresence, the thought of omnipresence, the thoughts of omnipresence, the thought of omnipresence, the word of omnipresence, the words of omnipresence, the word of omnipresence, the action of omnipresence, the actions of omnipresence, the action of omnipresence, the reaction of omnipresence, the reactions of omnipresence, the reaction of omnipresence, the feeling of omnipresence, the feelings of omnipresence, the feeling of omnipresence, the situation of omnipresence, the situations of omnipresence, the situation of omnipresence, the circumstance of omnipresence, the circumstances of omnipresence, the circumstance of omnipresence, the environment of omnipresence, the environments of omnipresence, the environment of omnipresence, the relationship of omnipresence, the relationships of omnipresence, the relationship of omnipresence, the number of omnipresence, the numbers of omnipresence, the number of omnipresence, the formula of omnipresence, the formulas of omnipresence, the formula of omnipresence, the equation of omnipresence, the equations of omnipresence, the equation of omnipresence, the theory of omnipresence, The theories of omnipresence. The theory of omnipresence. The symbol of omnipresence. The symbols of omnipresence. The symbol of omnipresence. The color of omnipresence. The colors of omnipresence. The color of omnipresence. The thing of omnipresence. The things of omnipresence. The thing of omnipresence. The way of omnipresence. The ways of omnipresence. The way of omnipresence. The place of omnipresence. The places of omnipresence. The place of omnipresence. The time of omnipresence. The times of omnipresence. The time of omnipresence. The event of omnipresence. The events of omnipresence. The event of omnipresence. The result of omnipresence. The results of omnipresence. The result of omnipresence. The crown of omnipresence. The crowns of omnipresence. The crown of omnipresence. The throne of omnipresence. The thrones of omnipresence. The throne of omnipresence. The omnipresence king. The omnipresence kings. The omnipresence kingdom. The omnipresence kingdoms. The omnipresence king's subject. The omnipresence king's subjects. The omnipresence king's dominion. The omnipresence king's dominions. The kingdom of omnipresence. The kingdoms of omnipresence. The kingdom of omnipresence. The omnipresence queen. The omnipresence queens. The omnipresence queendom. The omnipresence queendoms. The omnipresence queen subject. The omnipresence queen subjects. The omnipresence queen's dominion. The omnipresence queen's dominions. The queendom of omnipresence. The queendoms of omnipresence. The queendom of omnipresence. The omnipresence prince. The omnipresence princes. The omnipresence princedom. The omnipresence princedoms. The omnipresence prince's subject. The omnipresence prince's subjects. The omnipresence prince's dominion. The omnipresence prince's dominions. The princedom of omnipresence. The princedoms of omnipresence. The princedom of omnipresence. The omnipresence princess. The omnipresence princesses. The omnipresence princessdom. The omnipresence princessdoms. The omnipresence princess's subject. The omnipresence princess's subjects. The omnipresence princess's dominion. The omnipresence princess's dominions. The princessdom of omnipresence. The princessdoms of omnipresence. The princessdom of omnipresence. The Lord of omnipresence. The lords of omnipresence. The Lord of omnipresence. The lordess of omnipresence. The lordesses of omnipresence. The lordess of omnipresence. The priest of omnipresence. The priests of omnipresence. The priest of omnipresence. The priestess of omnipresence. The priestesses of omnipresence. The priestess of omnipresence. The ritual of omnipresence. The rituals of omnipresence. The ritual of omnipresence. The shrine of omnipresence. The shrines of omnipresence. The shrine of omnipresence. The temple of omnipresence. The temples of omnipresence. The temple of omnipresence. The leader of omnipresence. The leaders of omnipresence. The leader of omnipresence. The follower of omnipresence. The followers of omnipresence. The follower of omnipresence. The natural substance of omnipresence. The natural substances of omnipresence. The natural substance of omnipresence. The supernatural substance of omnipresence. The supernatural substances of omnipresence. The supernatural substance of omnipresence. The temporal substance of omnipresence. The temporal substances of omnipresence. The temporal substance of omnipresence. The spiritual substance of omnipresence. The spiritual substances of omnipresence. The spiritual substance of omnipresence. The natural form of omnipresence. The natural forms of omnipresence. The natural form of omnipresence. The supernatural form of omnipresence. The supernatural forms of omnipresence. The supernatural form of omnipresence. The temporal form of omnipresence. The temporal forms of omnipresence. The temporal form of omnipresence. The spiritual form of omnipresence. The spiritual forms of omnipresence. The spiritual form of omnipresence. The age of omnipresence. The ages of omnipresence. The age of omnipresence. The era of omnipresence. The heiress of omnipresence. The era of omnipresence. The awakener of omnipresence. The awakeners of omnipresence. The awakener of omnipresence. The awakening of omnipresence. The awakenings of omnipresence. The awakening of omnipresence. The realm of omnipresence. The realms of omnipresence. The realm of omnipresence. The dimension of omnipresence. The dimensions of omnipresence. The dimension of omnipresence. The zone of omnipresence. The zones of omnipresence. The zone of omnipresence. The frequency of omnipresence. The frequencies of omnipresence. The frequency of omnipresence. The century of omnipresence. The centuries of omnipresence. The century of omnipresence. The millennium of omnipresence. The millenniums of omnipresence. The millennium of omnipresence. The purpose of omnipresence. The purposes of omnipresence. The purpose of omnipresence. The meaning of omnipresence. The meanings of omnipresence. The meaning of omnipresence. The culture of omnipresence. The cultures of omnipresence. The culture of omnipresence. The demonstrator of omnipresence. The demonstrators of omnipresence. The demonstrator of omnipresence. The demonstration of omnipresence. The demonstrations of omnipresence. The demonstration of omnipresence. The manifester of omnipresence. The manifestors of omnipresence. The manifester of omnipresence. The manifestation of omnipresence. The manifestations of omnipresence. The manifestation of omnipresence. The presence of omnipresence. The presences of omnipresence. The presence of omnipresence. The glow of omnipresence. The glows of omnipresence. The glow of omnipresence. The goal of omnipresence. The goals of omnipresence. The goal of omnipresence. The plan of omnipresence. The plans of omnipresence. The plan of omnipresence. The book of omnipresence. The books of omnipresence. The book of omnipresence. The philosopher of omnipresence. The philosophers of omnipresence. The philosopher of omnipresence. The philosophy of omnipresence. The philosophies of omnipresence. The philosophy of omnipresence. The releaser of omnipresence. The releasers of omnipresence. The releaser of omnipresence. The release of omnipresence. The releases of omnipresence. The release of omnipresence. The variable of omnipresence. The variables of omnipresence. The variable of omnipresence. The cause of omnipresence. The causes of omnipresence. The cause of omnipresence. The effect of omnipresence. The effects of omnipresence. The effect of omnipresence. The journey of omnipresence. The journeys of omnipresence. The journey of omnipresence. The emergence of omnipresence. The emergences of omnipresence. The emergence of omnipresence. The source of omnipresence. The sources of omnipresence. The source of omnipresence. The originator of omnipresence. The originators of omnipresence. The originator of omnipresence. The origin of omnipresence. The origins of omnipresence. The origin of omnipresence. The forefather of omnipresence. The forefathers of omnipresence. The forefather of omnipresence. The foremother of omnipresence. The foremothers of omnipresence. The foremother of omnipresence. The ancestor of omnipresence. The ancestors of omnipresence. The ancestor of omnipresence. The descendant of omnipresence. The descendants of omnipresence. The descendant of omnipresence. The lineage of omnipresence. The lineages of omnipresence. The lineage of omnipresence. The heritage of omnipresence. The heritages of omnipresence. The heritage of omnipresence. The heir of omnipresence. The heirs of omnipresence. The heir of omnipresence. The co-heir of omnipresence. The co-heirs of omnipresence. The co-heir of omnipresence. The joint heir of omnipresence. The joint heirs of omnipresence. The joint heir of omnipresence. The dynasty of omnipresence. The dynasties of omnipresence. The dynasty of omnipresence. The force of omnipresence. The forces of omnipresence. The force of omnipresence. The law of omnipresence. The laws of omnipresence. The law of omnipresence. The pact of omnipresence. The pacts of omnipresence. The pact of omnipresence. The game of omnipresence. The games of omnipresence. The game of omnipresence. The mask of omnipresence. The masks of omnipresence. The mask of omnipresence. The armor of omnipresence. The armors of omnipresence. The armor of omnipresence. The sword of omnipresence. The swords of omnipresence. The sword of omnipresence. The shield of omnipresence. The shields of omnipresence. The shield of omnipresence. The force shield of omnipresence. The force shields of omnipresence. The force shield of omnipresence. The armored force shield of omnipresence. The armored force shields of omnipresence. The armored force shield of omnipresence. The champion of omnipresence. The champions of omnipresence. The champion of omnipresence. The guardian of omnipresence. The guardians of omnipresence. The guardian of omnipresence. The defender of omnipresence. The defenders of omnipresence. The defender of omnipresence. The protector of omnipresence. The protectors of omnipresence. The protector of omnipresence. The chant of omnipresence. The chants of omnipresence. The chant of omnipresence. The shape of omnipresence. The shapes of omnipresence. The shape of omnipresence. The cube of omnipresence. The cubes of omnipresence. The cube of omnipresence. The cuboid of omnipresence. The cuboids of omnipresence. The cuboid of omnipresence. The sphere of omnipresence. The spheres of omnipresence. The sphere of omnipresence. The spheroid of omnipresence. The spheroids of omnipresence. The spheroid of omnipresence. The prism of omnipresence. The prisms of omnipresence. The prism of omnipresence. The pyramid of omnipresence. The pyramids of omnipresence. The pyramid of omnipresence. The cylinder of omnipresence. The cylinders of omnipresence. The cylinder of omnipresence. The cone of omnipresence. The cones of omnipresence. The cone of omnipresence. The triangle of omnipresence. The triangles of omnipresence. The triangle of omnipresence. The circle of omnipresence. The circles of omnipresence. The circle of omnipresence. The semicircle of omnipresence. The semicircles of omnipresence. The semicircle of omnipresence. The square of omnipresence. The squares of omnipresence. The square of omnipresence. The rectangle of omnipresence. The rectangles of omnipresence. The rectangle of omnipresence. The parallelogram of omnipresence. The parallelograms of omnipresence. The parallelogram of omnipresence. The rhombus of omnipresence. The rhombuses of omnipresence. The rhombus of omnipresence. The trapezoid of omnipresence. The trapezoids of omnipresence. The trapezoid of omnipresence. The polygon of omnipresence. The polygons of omnipresence. The polygon of omnipresence. The pentagon of omnipresence. The pentagons of omnipresence. The pentagon of omnipresence. The hexagon of omnipresence. The hexagons of omnipresence. The hexagon of omnipresence. The septagon of omnipresence. The septagons of omnipresence. The septagon of omnipresence. The octagon of omnipresence. The octagons of omnipresence. The octagon of omnipresence. The nonagon of omnipresence. The nonagons of omnipresence. The nonagon of omnipresence. The decagon of omnipresence. The decagons of omnipresence. The decagon of omnipresence. The evolution of omnipresence. The evolutions of omnipresence. The evolution of omnipresence. The revolution of omnipresence. The revolutions of omnipresence. The revolution of omnipresence. The elemental art of omnipresence. The elemental arts of omnipresence. The elemental art of omnipresence. The elemental science of omnipresence. The elemental sciences of omnipresence. The elemental science of omnipresence. The elemental principle of omnipresence. The elemental principles of omnipresence. The elemental principle of omnipresence. The elemental technology of omnipresence. The elemental technologies of omnipresence. The elemental technology of omnipresence. The low elemental art of omnipresence. The low elemental arts of omnipresence. The low elemental art of omnipresence. The low elemental science of omnipresence. The low elemental sciences of omnipresence. The low elemental science of omnipresence. The low elemental principle of omnipresence. The low elemental principles of omnipresence. The low elemental principle of omnipresence. The low elemental technology of omnipresence. The low elemental technologies of omnipresence. The low elemental technology of omnipresence. The high elemental art of omnipresence. The high elemental arts of omnipresence. The high elemental art of omnipresence. The high elemental science of omnipresence. The high elemental sciences of omnipresence. The high elemental science of omnipresence. The high elemental principle of omnipresence. The high elemental principles of omnipresence. The high elemental principle of omnipresence. The high elemental technology of omnipresence. The high elemental technologies of omnipresence. The high elemental technology of omnipresence. The agent of omnipresence. The agents of omnipresence. The agent of omnipresence. The agency of omnipresence. The agencies of omnipresence. The agency of omnipresence. The amplifier of omnipresence. The amplifiers of omnipresence. The amplifier of omnipresence. The amplification of omnipresence. The amplifications of omnipresence. The amplification of omnipresence. The enhancer of omnipresence. The enhancers of omnipresence. The enhancer of omnipresence. The enhancement of omnipresence. The enhancements of omnipresence. The enhancement of omnipresence. The magnifier of omnipresence. The magnifiers of omnipresence. The magnifier of omnipresence. The magnification of omnipresence. The magnifications of omnipresence. The magnification of omnipresence. The influencer of omnipresence. The influencers of omnipresence. The influencer of omnipresence. The influence of omnipresence. The influences of omnipresence. The influence of omnipresence. The emanator of omnipresence. The emanators of omnipresence. The emanator of omnipresence. The emanation of omnipresence. The emanations of omnipresence. The emanation of omnipresence. The converger of omnipresence. The convergers of omnipresence. The converger of omnipresence. The convergence of omnipresence. The convergences of omnipresence. The convergence of omnipresence. The aura of omnipresence. The auras of omnipresence. The aura of omnipresence. The impression of omnipresence. The impressions of omnipresence. The impression of omnipresence. The intelligence of omnipresence. The intelligences of omnipresence. The intelligence of omnipresence. The sophistication of omnipresence. The sophistications of omnipresence. The sophistication of omnipresence. The genius of omnipresence. The geniuses of omnipresence. The genius of omnipresence. The polymath of omnipresence. The polymaths of omnipresence. The polymath of omnipresence. The psychic of omnipresence. The psychics of omnipresence. The psychic of omnipresence. The knowledge of omnipresence. The knowledges of omnipresence. The knowledge of omnipresence. The understanding of omnipresence. The understandings of omnipresence. The understanding of omnipresence. The wisdom of omnipresence. The wisdoms of omnipresence. The wisdom of omnipresence. The secret of omnipresence. The secrets of omnipresence. The secret of omnipresence. The mystery of omnipresence. The mysteries of omnipresence. The mystery of omnipresence. The revelation of omnipresence. The revelations of omnipresence. The revelation of omnipresence. The tactic of omnipresence. The tactics of omnipresence. The tactic of omnipresence. The strategy of omnipresence. The strategies of omnipresence. The strategy of omnipresence. The strength of omnipresence. The strengths of omnipresence. The strength of omnipresence. The might of omnipresence. The mights of omnipresence. The might of omnipresence. The power of omnipresence. The powers of omnipresence. The power of omnipresence. The authority of omnipresence. The authorities of omnipresence. The authority of omnipresence. The dominion of omnipresence. The dominions of omnipresence. The dominion of omnipresence. The rhythm of omnipresence. The rhythms of omnipresence. The rhythm of omnipresence. The melody of omnipresence. The melodies of omnipresence. The melody of omnipresence. The music of omnipresence. The musics of omnipresence. The music of omnipresence. The lyric of omnipresence. The lyrics of omnipresence. The lyric of omnipresence. The song of omnipresence. The songs of omnipresence. The song of omnipresence. The dance of omnipresence. The dances of omnipresence. The dance of omnipresence. The spirit of omnipresence. The spirits of omnipresence. The spirit of omnipresence. The soul of omnipresence. The souls of omnipresence. The soul of omnipresence. The body of omnipresence. The bodies of omnipresence. The body of omnipresence. The mark of omnipresence. The marks of omnipresence. The mark of omnipresence. The promise of omnipresence. The promises of omnipresence. The promise of omnipresence. The visionary of omnipresence. The visionaries of omnipresence. The visionary of omnipresence. The vision of omnipresence. The visions of omnipresence. The vision of omnipresence. The picture of omnipresence. The pictures of omnipresence. The picture of omnipresence. The sound of omnipresence. The sounds of omnipresence. The sound of omnipresence. The dung of omnipresence. The dungs of omnipresence. The dung of omnipresence. The language of omnipresence. The languages of omnipresence. The language of omnipresence. The communication of omnipresence. The communications of omnipresence. The communication of omnipresence. The people of omnipresence. The peoples of omnipresence. The people of omnipresence. The society of omnipresence. The societies of omnipresence. The society of omnipresence. The fortress of omnipresence. The fortresses of omnipresence. The fortress of omnipresence. The government of omnipresence. The governments of omnipresence. The government of omnipresence. The city of omnipresence. The cities of omnipresence. The city of omnipresence. The nation of omnipresence. The nations of omnipresence. The nation of omnipresence. The civilization of omnipresence. The civilizations of omnipresence. The civilization of omnipresence. The world of omnipresence. The worlds of omnipresence. The world of omnipresence.